Hello! This is apparently becoming a regular thing of me talking about and looking at the balance patches, because the last one did kinda well. I mean, go figure, doing something topical is good for the algorithm. Now, same restrictions apply as last time. I'm only coming at this from a PvE perspective, and particularly the PvE group content endgame stuff, because I am not the source of information you want for the competitive modes. And for PvE, the group content is what the game's balanced around, so that's where all of the discussion is happening. And again, just like last time, if you found any of this helpful or informative or interesting, do maybe leave a like and or subscribe. I don't ask for this in every video, just the ones that take a while to make, and it lets me know that these are actually worth doing, so yeah. But before we get into the actual notes, I want to talk a little bit about the current state of things, about the patches, and my take on it. This was something I brought up in a pinned comment that I ended up adding to the last video, but if you don't care about all of that, then here's the timecode. It should also be a chapter. Feel free to skip to that. But for now, let's talk for a moment about the balance patches in themselves. Because oh boy did people not like the June balance patch. And some of it was justified. There are things broken in both directions, completely overpowered and underpowered, discovered in less than 2 days, which is why we ended up getting the preview patch notes early, just to make people less mad. And some of it was the exact type of responses that are the reason that you can't take the forum and Reddit seriously. Not calling out anything specific, but if you know, you know. But I had a rather controversial take on this, because I think the patch was completely fine. Now, put down your pitchforks and let me explain why that is. The way I see it, people are missing the point of patches like the last one, because they are not balance patches. Yes, they are called balance patches, but this was not a balance patch. I would more aptly name it a rework patch, because about once a year, usually in summer, we get one of these patches where the point isn't to balance the game, it is to allow ANET space to rework old design paradigms and update them for modern frameworks. This happens because things like elite specializations and how they play weren't planned an expansion in advance. When they were making Heart of Thorns, they had no idea how what we now consider to be the standard 5-man composition was going to turn out. And when they were making Path of Fire, they didn't know they were going to stop at 3 elite specializations for the foreseeable future. Because of this, they ended up boxing themselves into certain corners that don't align with wider goals for the game. Last year, this was class buffs, where Warrior was never allowed to do anything interesting because it had banners, and everything it did had to be centered around having banners. This year, it's support roles. It's filling out the missing boons on all the classes where they added it in the wrong or weird places or didn't add them at all. Where we also reevaluate the philosophy that maybe taking up all of your utility slots to do boons isn't great. And to be honest, when you do big changes like this, shit's going to go wrong. That is just a fact. But in the long term, I certainly think the game's gonna be much better for it. In fact, I'd be more concerned if a patch like this was boring than if it was poorly balanced. Because the idea behind it is solid, and that is what matters in the long term. Numbers and individual pieces are easy to tweak and change. Base concepts are not. And this is why we need patches like this. Would it be better if they came pre-balanced perfectly? Yes. Is that a realistic thing to ask for? No. Decidedly no. And I think the better way of looking at the mess that's been going on for the past 3-ish weeks is as a fun bit of chaos needed to establish a better thing in the future. And I think that's pretty easy to do when you simply manage your expectations that big changes are gonna have mistakes, but that they will be fixed within the coming weeks after. And I think this patch is a very good step in the right direction for exactly that. So really, it's just time to take the whole thing with a bit of humor and laugh at how broken things are, because that's gonna be gone soon anyway, and everything will turn out fine. Which turns it from frustrating to funny. You get to abuse the broken supports for 3 weeks, and that's funny. because in a year you won't remember the week where quickness Deadeye was broken as frustrating, but you might very well still appreciate the ability to play quickness Thief at all. And if you can't see the humor in that, or at least take it lightly, ask yourself if you're not just stuck in the Doomer mindset. And if you are gonna be upset about any change they made, no matter what it was or how it was implemented. I could talk so much more about this, you have no idea how much I've had to cut out of this rant, but I've swung out enough hornet's nests. Maybe let's go look at some actual patch notes now, huh? Also, I hope you can't hear all the noise in the background. There's construction, there's lawn mowing. It's not great. Anyway, Elementalist. Ellie is only getting competitive changes, and that's completely fine. It's pretty much all where it wants to be right now. The only thing that's maybe worth looking at is Power Tempest, but there is more pressing matters. NG didn't have any changes announced, but they are getting something. Blast Gyro on Scrapper is getting its cooldown reduced from 25 seconds to 20 seconds. So, a lot of people have not been happy about how the new Scrapper works, but there's also been some pretty wild misinformation on what you actually need to do to keep up quickness with the reworked trait, because it actually requires fewer skills than it used to. A lot of it just seems like people complaining about things being different, which is always a bit silly, but the two rather valid points about Scrapper are that, one, the skills you do use to upkeep quickness, which are Hammer 3 and Throw Mine, don't feel great. They could really use some animation tweaks to make them feel better to use. And this is kind of the band-aid fix to that, because Blast Gyro feels better than Throw Mine, and if you could replace Mine with Gyro, that would help a lot. But you're primarily running Mine because it has such a low cooldown, at 15 seconds, which is still less. But now it's a little easier to consider Blast Gyro an option by just building a little bit more boon duration, and then you don't have to deal with Mine. The one that's actually kind of getting screwed over is Heal Scrapper, because this way of applying quickness doesn't really work with its kit, and they should probably look at that again, but you already have a really good healer with Mechanist, and Quick Scrapper is mechanically completely fine. So yeah, this is the only thing that Engineer is getting. The other changes are competitive modes. Next up, Guardian. Guardian is actually getting a meaningful change in that how Willbender applies Alacrity is getting changed a bit. So the Restorative Virtues trait no longer gives Alacrity, which frees up your second trait slot in Willbender, and Phoenix Protocol now grants most of its Alacrity on activation, while applying less pulsing Alacrity, resulting in what I think is net neutral boon duration, but this means that no longer is all of your Alacrity dependent on hitting the target. Instead, you get a big block of Alacrity up front, and then some ticks of it when you keep hitting things. This is a huge quality of life improvement. This may very well finally be enough to put Alac Willbender on the map for real, instead of it just being a slightly gimmicky, like speed clear orientated option because it had quite high damage, but nothing else. So overall, it will be a lot more consistent and easier to play, which is obviously quite good. Guardian is also getting a couple small animation changes, but nothing major. On to Mesmer, and I swear in somebody's contract on the balance team, there must be a clause that Alac Mirage is getting changed every patch or else they lose their job, because it's happening again. Basically, they're very sick of the fact that the only thing you have to take to do Alac is a staff and nothing else, and that's already a pretty good Condi weapon. So we're reworking where you get Alacrity from. It's still on staff, but you now also have to take the reworked Mirage Mantle trait, which, instead of giving you protection, now adds additional effects to the ambush skills, including putting Alac on staff. Notably, the base duration for this is over a second longer than what it currently is. The reason, I think, is that this trait conflicts with Desert Distortion, which gave you extra ambush casts upon picking up Mirage Mirrors, so the extra duration is meant to compensate for this. It also conflicts with the Axe trait, because again, they really don't want Staff Axe to be a thing, for some reason. I'm guessing it's because they want to be able to balance Alac Mirage and Condi Mirage separately, so they are trying to create less overlap between the two. I couldn't tell you how exactly this works out numbers-wise. I'm guessing it's a small nerf to the damage, which is a little bit unnecessary, but we'll see how this works out. I can't imagine it being a massive amount. Virtuoso is also getting a small buff. The F5 is getting its damage increased because ever since they've removed the block from it, that skill is having an identity crisis. I don't think this fixes it, but it's something. Now for a class that's actually kind of been a problem, Necro. Because, oh boy, the Scourge changes did not go over well, and, yeah, they massively undershot the alacrity duration, which has been making the whole thing feel absolutely terrible, among other reasons. So, Scourge is now getting a lot of very, very good buffs. Let's first talk about the damage side of things. So, the Torch trait is getting its cooldown reduction removed, and that's being rolled into the base Torch skills, with the trait now increasing your burn damage instead. Torch is also getting some utility buffs alongside that. The Sadistic Searing trait also no longer cares about punishment skills, and instead makes your F2 do burning. This is more consistent, easier to use, and no longer makes you use your healing skill as a DPS skill. Demonic Lore is also getting a straight buff, increasing the buffed torment damage from 25 to 33%, which is a lot. Something that affects all versions of Scourge, no matter what, is the minor traits, which no longer care about how many shades are active. Instead, it just cares about if you have a shade active or not. This is a consolation prize for the duration nerf on the shades, which will make it less annoying to use, but still kind of annoying. There's really no reason for these to have this short of a duration in PvE. I think the reason why they wanted this is so that the F4 can no longer constantly pulse, but at that point, please just rework how transfusion works on Scourge. Anyway, these do affect the support versions, but for the DPS version, this is a lot of nice changes. DPS Scourge was always predicated on the fact that it also happens to do a lot of support on the side, which is why it got away with having such low general damage. Now that a lot of the support options have been nerfed, it's fallen off the face of the earth, and this is compensation for that, which is good. But the big one is obviously Alacrity Scourge, which is getting its base alacrity duration buffed from 1 second to 1.5 seconds. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a 50% duration increase, and that really adds up. We'll see if this is enough or if it'll need more. That's something we can only really judge in-game, but it's a great step in the right direction for sure. You also now get more Barrier, just in general, both from the Electrate getting buffed and the F3 having its nerf on the Barrier application from last patch completely reverted to how it was before, which is great. There was literally no reason why this was done. This helps both just general support Scourge and heal Scourge. Very good change. The Traitor Shroud, which before was kind of the only thing that was meaningful to run on heal Scourge anyway, now also grants protection, which is, again, super important for heal Scourge. It had no protection source before, which made it very hard to find a fitting quickness partner for you. Additionally, Well of Blood is getting changed, in that it now heals less to you on initial cast, but ticks increased healing to everyone and scales with more healing power. This is going to make this actually good direct healing for heal Scourge, which is also very, very needed because all of your normal healing is either barrier or regen, and that's kinda shitty. Overall, I can't say if this saves Scourge. This is something we entirely have to see in gameplay, something that just has to be tested out. But you might still have to run quite high boon duration to make Alacrity Scourge work, but it has a lot better chance of working now, and Heal Scourge has much better tools now. We are on the right track for sure. Up next, a class with a lot of similar issues, Ranger. Let's talk about Druid. Except for the Conde DPS version, ironically, it's not been doing well. And most of it ends up coming down to the Alacrity duration, just like with Scourge, which they also undershot by way too much. So now it's getting increased from 3/3 of a second to a second, or in other words, 33%. Again, doesn't sound like a lot, but this procs so many times, it really does add up. Though in this case, I don't think it's enough. It probably needs to go to at least like 1.5 seconds before it's fine. It would also be great if this pulsed from you rather than being added to the CA skills, because then you could reliably trigger it with the 1 and 2 without constantly missing half the group. But alas. This one people have been decrying as terrible design because you have to go into CA to do boons, which is just a bit silly. the issue would be entirely solved as soon as the alacrity duration is long enough, because then you can generate so much excess alac uptime that you can comfortably delay your CA for long enough that it will align with your healing needs. You would have needed to go into it eventually anyway, and if you're not doing it at least once every 30 seconds, then yeah, I don't really know what you're doing. You had to go into CA beforehand anyway to do Might, even if you had other sources for that boon. So it's not really that different, it's just a matter of the duration. And I do have to remind you that almost every form of utility that you have in CA, you also have elsewhere in your kit. So even if you had to use CA mostly for boons and topping people off, that would still work perfectly fine. So once they fix the duration, which we'll see if this is enough, again, I doubt it, it just turns into a skill issue, quite frankly. They have also buffed almost all of the spirits, except the elite, which now have a reduced cooldown, as well as longer buff duration. Might sources outside of CA are also getting buffed, with Warhorn 5 and Spirited Revival having their duration increased, and in the case of Spirited Revival, also their stacks, making it easier to apply Might now, since you no longer get it from Grace of the Land. Though I will say, putting this on Spirited Revival is a bit of a weird place for it. It's probably the most awkward to use Might source on Druid. Again, this is another one we just have to see in-game. I'm hoping it's enough, but I think we're gonna have to see this on here again, pulling the duration up by another, half a second or so. Untamed is getting the quickness trait buffed. The duration is going from 4 seconds to 5 seconds. Additionally, you will now always immediately get Unleashed Ambush when you swap weapons while you're in Unleash, which is a very nice quality of life change, and will make this whole thing work much easier. It might still end up requiring a bit too much boon duration to be good, but again, step in the right direction, we'll have to see how it plays out. Also, just to put this out there, DPS Untamed is actually mostly fine. It already has a 40k benchmark with a new build, though Condi appears to be kind of dead. That's unfortunate, but judging by how they did not buff the Condi ambushes, that seems to be intentional. It seems that they want Druid and Soul Beast to be the Condi ones, and then Untamed does quickness and power, which does kind of make sense. Next up, Herald. Now, the opinions on Herald has been basically split down the middle from what I can tell, and I cannot find the pattern on who likes it and who doesn't. Personally, I haven't been a fan, but I think they're doing something pretty smart here. So the quickness application is getting a slight rework, in that instead of pulsing 3 seconds every 3 seconds, you're now pulsing 1.25 seconds every 1 second. Additionally, you also get a bunch of your power converted into concentration, and you get even more concentration from your miners. It's a lot of free boon duration is what I'm telling you, and overall the base quickness duration has been increased by 20%. Now, while this seems a bit weird at first, what this actually achieves is that missing any individual tick of pulsing quickness is no longer punishing. You can easily generate a ton of excess uptime, which frees up your rotation and energy management to do other stuff besides just letting it tick down for quickness. This is essentially the exact same idea that I was putting forward for Druid, where as long as you can generate enough excess quickness, you can do other stuff. And I think that's pretty smart. They've also increased the Might duration from Shared Empowerment by a third, and yeah, I got somebody to test this for me while I was recording, and apparently you can keep up 25 Might in pure Berserker's gear, so that's something actually pretty unique in favor of Herald, because generally quickness supports can't do that. I consider this a pretty fantastic change, though obviously this also has to be tested to see if it works properly, but it will likely free up Herald to do more stuff than it's currently doing, and that's obviously a good thing. Now for the really complicated one, Thief, because, the Thief support builds have been absolutely broken. Just to mention before we get into that, Daredevil is doing fine, it's on the 40k, doing great, so the Daredevil buffs have already worked. Everything else is gonna get nerfed, and that is a good thing. Now, on Deadeye, first off, we're getting a bunch of damage nerfs across the board. Premeditation, Iron Sights, and Shadow Flare are all having their damage reduced. And this affects both the quickness version and the DPS version. And you might think that that's kind of mean for the DPS version, but for one, it's sitting at 46k, which is a bit excessive, even for its design space. and 2, this is a compensation nerf for it benefiting so extremely hard from the flanking changes. Backstab now being guaranteed massively spiked Deadeye's actual in-fight damage, not just its benchmark damage, and so that's why we're getting nerfs in other places. And honestly, I think that's pretty reasonable. Now for Quickness Deadeye, 1 in the Chamber now no longer increases stolen skill damage by 300%, which was completely ludicrous to begin with, and instead it only now increases it by 10%. 1 in the Chamber is not used on the DPS version, so this only affects the Quickness one. And well, Quickness Deadeye is way, way broken when it comes to the DPS. This is a direct nerf to it, but I doubt it's gonna be enough. We'll have to see. Of course, going from 300 to 10 is a big jump, but I was hoping for them to nerf the quickness duration a little bit so that you would have to build some boon duration, which for power builds always reduces the damage more than for Connie builds, so that would have been quite impactful. We'll have to see where the benchmark ends up. Maybe I'm underestimating just how much 300% to 10 makes up here, but I think this is one we're going to have to see in the patch notes again. Now, Spectre, ironically, completely overshot the alacrity duration. I have this crazy conspiracy theory that they calculated the numbers for Druid on Scourge, like, mathematically, to be exactly what they needed to upkeep alacrity at a certain amount of high boon duration, and they couldn't do that for Spectre because, 1, they completely introduced a new way of doing boons with Spectre, and 2, Spectre is just new and not that popular up till now, so they didn't have as much data on it. So they just called a safe bet and gave it way too much alacrity. But again, that is not confirmed, that is entirely my conspiracy theory. They are now reducing the base alacrity duration from 2 seconds to 1.25 seconds, which is a lot. Spectre could do full alacrity in DPS gear, and changing from Vipers into Ritualist doesn't tend to actually lose you that much damage. So this is a very good way of doing it, but an even smarter nerf they're doing is they're shuffling around the Torment traits. So Larcenous Torment no longer gives you increased Torment damage, but instead it just steals some health. But Strength of Shadows is getting reworked as well, where it no longer extends the buff of Rottweiler Venom, and instead now increases the Torment damage by 25%, so 15% more than you were getting the increase beforehand. And this is a lot easier to use than Rottweiler Venom, because on the DPS version, you don't really want to target your allies like ever. This also conflicts with the actual alacrity trait, which means that this is essentially a DPS nerf to the alacrity version, and I don't know how this affects the DPS version DPS-wise, if this is a net neutral, though I think they were hoping for a net neutral, but that is the right way of doing it, because Alac Spectre was just doing too much damage, had to give up too little compared to the DPS version, just like Quickness Deadeye in the same category. So this is a very clever way of doing it. I was hoping they were going to do something similar again for Deadeye as well, but we'll see how Deadeye plays out. I'm just a bit scared of Quickness Deadeye, to be honest. Also, aside from that, Shadow Sap, the Scepter 2, is having its protection duration increased from 2 to 4 seconds, which I can't tell you if that means full protection uptime, but it is a very helpful buff for Heal Spectre. The main issue that still plagues Heal Spectre is of course the quality of life issues, because ally targeting is just so annoying to deal with, but every little bit helps. And last, Warrior, the thing that they didn't announce any changes beforehand, just that they were looking at it, and there's only 2. So first off, Arc Divider is getting its damage increased. This, I'm gonna be honest, wasn't necessary. I'm strongly of the opinion that Power Berserker is an extremely easy thing to play. It's very safe, it has a ton of defense, and it has decent utility now. So for that, its damage really does not need to be that high, and it was sitting at like 39k, which is slightly below average in terms of benchmarks. It didn't need a buff. What this is supposed to be for is that post-patch, Greatsword was no longer really worth using. You were mostly just camping Axe the entire time, so they want to get rid of this and actually let you meaningfully use Greatsword again, but I'm not particularly happy with how they're doing it. I hope at some point we just get to look at Axe again and see that it's not necessarily the healthiest thing for Warrior to use as it does, and we maybe get that looked at so that there's a bit more balance in like what Warrior weapons are actually good, because Axe just tends to overshadow everything. On a completely different note, Heat the Soul is having its base quickness duration increased from 3.5 seconds to 4 seconds, and that's probably not enough. So they're kind of misunderstanding the problem with Heat the Soul. The thing is, it's not difficult to do a bunch of burst skills that would in theory upkeep quickness. The problem is hitting those burst skills in time with the internal cooldown of Heat the Soul. Essentially, it would need to do so much quickness that one burst skill generates enough quickness to cover the entire internal cooldown and then some, so that you can actually start stacking up the quickness duration rather than having to hit it exactly on the cooldown. This is just kind of shitty design. The problem here is, again, Axe, because you can spam the Axe burst as much as possible. They can't give it no internal cooldown, because then Axe just completely breaks this trait. But I think there is probably a better way of doing this than they are doing it now, because right now, Berserker has to take an absolute ton of boon duration, or just an absolute ton of quickness duration to be specific, just to be able to cover the downtime you have, because you can't precisely hit it on every internal cooldown, which is an internal cooldown that you can't even see. If you want to complain about one of the boon applications being poorly designed, this is it. This is it. Also, there is no mention of Alack Blightsworn. People have been wondering about this because it's not up in Snowcross or anything, but it's probably fine. The benchmark is still being worked on. Blightsworn always takes a little bit longer to figure out because there's a lot of things you can experiment with, and the rotation is always a bit different. But I've already seen a 34k Alacrity Blightsworn benchmark, which is a healthy place for an Alacrity build to be. Also, Condi Berserker is a bit too strong right now, purely in terms of the benchmark. It is a little bit awkward to use. I was hoping they were going to look at that, but it's not like an emergency thing, and I think that might require some more tweaking of the build as a whole and its pieces, so maybe we see that in the future. In closing, this patch is a step in the right direction for sure. We're getting basically all of the major problems from the last patch addressed somehow. There are some things that would have been nice to see but weren't absolutely necessary. The two that I'm still concerned over is Quickness Deadeye might still be overpowered, and Quickness Berserker is probably still a bit unplayable. We'll see about Quickness Untamed, not sure about that one. But everything else in this patch is a great change. We'll have to see how the new boon durations work out. This is probably not the last one, but we are also coming up very, very close to the expansion release, and the ability to cross over elite specialization weapons onto any spec will create a whole host of new problems to deal with, and I have no idea how they're going to deal with that, but that's a problem for another day. So this didn't take quite as long to record as the last one, but it still got pretty late because I got interrupted a lot. But if you're hearing this, then thank you very much for watching to this point. By the time I finish editing, it's probably going to be pretty late, and it's a work day again, so would be lovely if you could share some support for the channel so that I know if this is worth continuing. But yeah, thank you for watching. Have a good night. Hopefully this patch is less broken. Fingers crossed.